Hello, hi, welcome back to my channel. Today we will discuss about the fetal head skull. Fetal head or skull, which is also we can call as cranium. The fetal head is formed by 8 bones. So one is sphenoid bone, another ethmoid, and 2 temporal bones together forms the base of the skull. Here we can see in the picture the base of the skull. So one sphenoid and one ethmoid and 2 temporal bones forms the base of the skull. This is the base of the skull, which has sphenoid, ethmoid and 2 temporal bones. And frontal bones 1 fused together, occipital bone 1 and parietal bones 2 together form the top portion of the skull. You could see from this picture 2 parietal bones and 1 frontal bone plus occipital bone. They together form a top portion of the head, while the base is formed by 1 ethmoid, 1 sphenoid and 2 temporal bones. Totally 4 bones together forms the fetal skull. Now let us see about the sutures of the fetal skull. Sutures are nothing but the 2 bones are brought together with the help of a thin membrane or connect together is called as sutures. Suture is nothing but a thin membrane between 2 bones togetherly holding the 2 bones is called as suture line or suture. So here if we see in this picture, the 2 frontal bones are forming a single bone with the help of frontal suture. The 2 frontal bones are togetherly binded by the frontal suture, and in between the 2 parietal bones in the middle of the picture, in between the 2 parietal bones there is a sagittal suture. And next, if you see in between the frontal bones and parietal bones anteriorly, if you observe here in between the 2 parietal bones and 2 frontal bones anteriorly, that is coronal suture. The coronal suture is binding frontal bones with the parietal bones, binding frontal bones with the 2 parietal bones, that is called as coronal suture, anterior portion of the skull. And if we come to the posterior portion of the skull, the 2 parietal bones posteriorly fusing together with the occiput with the help of the lambdoid suture. With the help of the lambdoid suture, the 2 parietal bones are attached to the occipital bone with the help of lambdoid suture. Now we'll see about the fontanelles of fetal skull. There are mainly 2 types of fontanelles. 2 fontanelles are there in the fetal skull mainly. So the first one is the anterior fontanella. If you see from the picture, the anterior fontanella is the junction between the 2 frontal bones and 2 parietal bones. The junction between the 2 frontal bones and 2 parietal bones and the junction of the coronal suture is known as the anterior fontanella. The anterior fontanella diameter is 3 into 3 centimeters. Anterior fontanella diameter is 3 into 3 centimeters and which closes by 18 months of child's age. By 18 months that anterior fontanella gets closed. Anterior fontanella gets closed by 18 months or 1.5 year. 18 months also we can call it in 1.5 year. About the posterior fontanella, lambdoid sutures junction is called as posterior fontanella. In other words, the junction between the 2 parietal bones and the occipital bone, in the lambdoid suture is known as the posterior fontanella. The posterior fontanella gets closed sooner than the anterior fontanella. Posterior fontanella gets closed sooner than the anterior fontanella, that is about at 1.5 month. 1.5 month the posterior fontanella gets ossified or bone gets formed in the posterior fontanella's place. Two more less important fontanellas are anterolateral sphenoidal fontanella. Anterolateral or sphenoidal fontanella. It is anteriorly present and laterally present, so it is called as anterolateral fontanella you can call, or otherwise sphenoidal fontanella you can call, because this temporal bone is insidely, it is attached to the sphenoidal bone. And if we come to the posterior back side of the skull, the posterolateral back side of the skull is known as posterolateral or mastroidal fontanella. Posterolateral or mastroidal fontanella. These are less important fontanellas, but the main fontanellas are anterior fontanella and posterior fontanella. But if they ask how many fontanellas are there, means you should say 6 fontanellas are there, because anterior fontanella, posterior fontanella, along with that these anterolateral and posterolateral fontanellas are present on both the sides of the skull. On both the sides of the skull, these anterior lateral and posterior lateral fontanellas are present on the both the sides of the skull. So they are 4 fontanellas. Lateral fontanellas are 4 and the main fontanellas are 2. They are altogether 6 fontanellas are there. And now presentations of fetal skull during the time of the delivery. What are the presenting parts that we can see in the fetal skull? First one is face, bregma, brow, vertex and sinciput, occiput. Totally there are 6 presentations are there. Face presentation, bregma presentation, brow presentation, vertex presentation and sinciput, occiput, even mentum presentation also there. Totally 7 we can say. If you see from this picture, the anterior fontanella is also known as bregma presentation. Anterior fontanella is also known as bregma presentation. Vertex means the portion between the anterior fontanella and the posterior fontanella. The portion between the anterior fontanella and the posterior fontanella, the space between this is called as vertex. This is called as vertex. And whereas brow, the space between the anterior fontanella and the nasal bridge is known as brow. The space between the nasal bridge and anterior fontanella is called as brow presentation. Whereas face presentation means the direct fetal face presentation is known as face presentation. And sinciput means the presentation of the frontal bones. Exactly, the frontal bones is known as the sinciput. If the occiput is present at the doorstep of the vagina, is known as the occipital presentation. There is face presentation, brow presentation, bregma presentation, vertex presentation, occiput presentation and sinciput presentation. Now let us see the very important part of this explanation is the fetal skull measurements. These fetal skull measurements are very much important even for your clinical examination. So let us see how many measurements are there in the fetal skull. First one is the suboccipito-bregmatic diameter, occipito-frontal diameter, occipito-mental diameter, biparietal diameter, mento-vertical diameter and submento-vertical diameter. There are 6 diameters. First one suboccipito-bregmatic, occipito-frontal, occipito-mental, biparietal, mento-vertical and submento vertical. Let us see one by one how to measure it. Biparietal diameter we have to measure from the parietal eminence, from the one part of the parietal eminence to the other parietal bone's eminence is known as the biparietal diameter. Biparietal diameter we have to measure from one part of the parietal eminence to the other parietal bone's eminence is called as biparietal eminence or diameter. So it measures about 9.5 centimeters. 9.5 centimeters. Sometimes they take subparietal diameter also. Subparietal diameter is just besides of the parietal eminence. We will have to measure. So subparietal diameter is about 8.5 centimeters. 8.5 centimeters about subparietal diameter. Now mentovertical means from the angle of the mentum. I told you chin or mandible bone angle is known as mentum. So from the angle of the mandibular bone to the vertex region is called as mentovertical. From the angle of the mandible to the vertex part is called as the measurement mentovertical. This is about 13.5 centimeters to 14 centimeters. 13.5 to 14 centimeters. In different books different measurements are kept, but the range is 13.5 to 14 centimeters. This is the greatest measurement of the fetal skull and the largest measurement of the fetal skull. And submentobrachmatic means I told you that the anterior fontanella also known as the bregma. Anterior fontanella also known as the bregma. So to measure submentobrachmatic diameter, we'll have to keep our tape few centimeters away from the angle of the mandible, or we can call as ram of the mandible to the anterior fontanella. To the anterior fontanella we can call it as submentobrachmatic diameter. This measures about 9.5 centimeters. This measures about 9.5 centimeters. And occipitofrontal. In the name itself we can see two bones diameter we are measuring from the occipit to the frontal bones. So from the bridge of the nose to the bony prominence of the occipit. From the bridge of the nose to the bony prominence of the occipit is called as occipitofrontal diameter. Occipitofrontal diameter. It is about 11.5 centimeters to 12 centimeters. 11.5 centimeters to 12 centimeters. And suboccipitobregmatic next diameter is from the lateral portion, means below the bony prominence of the occipit to the bregma or anterior fontanella. From the lateral portion of the bony prominence of the occipit to the anterior fontanella is called as suboccipitobregmatic diameter. Suboccipitobregmatic diameter. It is about 9.5 centimeters. 9.5 centimeters. Last diameter is suboccipitofrontal. Suboccipitofrontal is from the bony prominence of the frontal bone or sinciput to the lateral portion of the occipit. To the lateral portion of the occiput is called as suboccipitofrontal diameter. Suboccipitofrontal diameter will have to check from the bony prominence of frontal bones to the anterior portion of the frontal bones to the lateral portion of the occipital bone is known as the suboccipitofrontal diameter. This measures about 10 centimeters, 9.5 to 10 centimeters. Suboccipital frontal diameter is 10 centimeters. Now I wanted to add one point, that the fetal head molding. Fetal head molding. Fetal head molding nothing but during the process of normal delivery, the overlapping of these sutures takes place to mold the head according to the shape of the vagina to facilitate the baby head to come out of the vagina easily. To come out of the fetal head out of the vagina easily. Fetal head molding is nothing but the overlapping of the fetal sutures and bones during the process of normal delivery is called as fetal head molding. This is our today's class. Today we discussed about the bones of the fetal skull, fontanelles of the fetal skull, parts of the fetal presentation, and the diameters or measurements of the fetal skull. Thank you for watching. Please share, subscribe, and encourage me. If you comment positive or negative also, I will get encouraged, and we'll see you in the next topic. Thank you.